Right. Professor Swaran Singh, if I can come to you. In its representation at the United Nations, India has spoken about support to the ASEAN initiative and the 5 point census in particular. If I can quote from there, important phrases: constructive dialogue among all parties concerned, mediation to be facilitated by an envoy of ASEAN's chair. These are important phrases and talk much about the kind of approach that India is supporting. How do you see that as a potential solution, which is led by ASEAN, which is led by the leaders of the region, that could change for a better tomorrow for Myanmar?
Two things to begin with. The whole world, including India, believes that if any multilateral institution will have some influence on Myanmar military, it is going to be ASEAN, which is where Myanmar is a member of ASEAN.
Yes.
And therefore, all nations have supported that idea that ASEAN should be allowed to take the lead. But as you mentioned, that summit meeting that was held in April in Jakarta to address this issue came up with this 5 point consensus. But even that does not mention the release of political prisoners. No mention of Aung San Suu Kyi. So fundamentally, even ASEAN, which we all put our faith in, understand its limitations, and that is simply because two of the veto-wielding nations in UN Security Council, Russia and China, incidentally also the largest weapon suppliers to the Myanmar military, are not in favor. They have abstained from this resolution by UN General Assembly. And one has to understand the enormous power and influence that military has in Myanmar. It is seen as an institution which is the most well organized and powerful institution. It is an institution that brought independence to Myanmar. It is an institution that openly controls the gas, oil, and mining, and therefore it's not dependent even financially on civilian government. So, enormous power, and of course, this whole recent 2016 onward, the ethnic cleansing that they carried on Rohingyas,
right,
has emboldened the military clearly, and such a resolution, which has not one of the Myanmar's neighbors standing and supporting it, I think fundamentally is underlining that how global governance and the major powers that are going to deliver at international decision making are themselves at loggerheads with each other. So it perhaps reveals much more of the weaknesses of international system and perhaps strength of the Myanmar military than the gradual piecemeal persuasion, which perhaps, as Ambassador just mentioned, could have been applied, and India has been in favor of that one should pass resolutions only when they are likely to be implemented. And it seems that apparently this resolution, may be supported by 119 countries, but look at important nations. All the neighbors, China, Russia, are not in support of it. Right. So in that sense, I think it's a little premature attempt on behalf of the United Nations.
Right. Professor Singh, while India has made its perspective and point of view very clear, the fact of the matter is that this resolution has also been clear at the United Nations. What is the way forward? What is the implications of it? The sort of, is this resolution binding? The application of it? What happens next in the delicate situation that India finds itself in?
I think India definitely has important stakes, as was mentioned by Ambassador Prachu. India's northeastern region is the neighboring region, and therefore a stable situation in Myanmar. And ideally speaking, a democratic government in Myanmar is to India's favor, there is no doubt. And India has been engaging at multiple levels, both at bilateral level. India has, over the last 20 years plus, has gradually engaged military leaders and I think has gained a certain amount of influence in the decision making in China, in the Myanmar military. India has also been at the same time engaging these issues at the level of quadrilateral security framework program. At the summit meeting mid-March, this issue was discussed again. So at multiple levels, India has to engage. India currently thinks that ASEAN perhaps is best placed in seeking some kind of return to democracy in Myanmar. Respect for elections is being underlined. But it's not going to happen very easily, particularly if military feels under pressure. And that is the trigger, in fact. If you see the thumping majority that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party received in November elections had perhaps threatened the armed forces, that despite them having set in the constitution that 25% of seats will be for the serving with armed forces the officials, and any fundamental change would require about two-thirds of majority, which obviously made it difficult for any single party to reach that stage. But that kind of majority that NLD received in November election had created certain concerns. People are also saying now that General Ming Aung Liang, who was to retire next month in July,
Right.
perhaps also personally sought an extension for his own sort of control on politics personally, to ensure that military doesn't give in very quickly in this experiment of gradual democratization. So one has to understand both institutional and individual interests and motivations of various stakeholders within Myanmar to see what buttons to press and how to influence that reality. And I think to some extent, the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi had maintained a kind of a studied silence and during the ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas, which saw a million plus of them sort of leaving the country, had in some ways also kind of eroded that shine of iconic leader Aung San Suu Kyi. And you remember there was also call in social media that her Nobel Prize should be withdrawn. So I think that charisma that Aung San Suu Kyi had perhaps also stands a bit more compromised as of today. So India has to look at what are the leverages India has. And I think on top of it, India would see leverages of its direct engagement with the military leadership in Myanmar, and of course working through ASEAN. And that seems to be a much likely scenario where all the neighboring countries can come together and sort of each one piecemeal works on the local regime, reassuring them that there is no attempt to divest them of their power in politics, which they are used. So military has always been, particularly from 1962, in control of politics, even when the so-called democratic experiments were carried out several times, at least 3 times now. So military has to be assured that nobody is trying to push them off the cliff in that sense, and that will generate only reactive reaction that we have seen. We have already seen nearly 900 people killed in military violence, and of course 5,000 people in detention. Thousands are being displaced again, and India might again be, suffering some kind of consequences. We saw what happened in case of Rohingyas. The immediate region, I think, is where the concern has to be utmost. Immediate neighboring countries have to be brought into sort of picture, taken into confidence, and that is where I think solution lies. And they will have to work through ASEAN, which is where Myanmar sits there as a member country. And remember, ASEAN way is about indirect influence.
Right.
It's not a direct influence, which it's like first name basis retreats and gradual preventive diplomacy style. That I think is how it is going to work. And India perhaps is very determined that that is the kind of strategy India wants to support at multilateral level, but also at the same time continuously work on bilateral channels that India has. And that is driven simply by our own national interest, by our own interest in ensuring peace and stability and sort of prosperity in our India's northeast, because that is about 1,700 kilometers border that we share with Myanmar, and we have had certain negative experience in the past. We don't want to see that repeated. So I think India clearly has a defined strategy, and this resolution to me perhaps deviates the focus from that piecemeal, imperceptible, indirect approach to resolving the issue in Myanmar and makes it high profile,
Right.
much more publicized way of dealing with it, which perhaps is going to be reactive, and perhaps armed forces are going to feel much more on the defensive, which perhaps is not a good start.
Right. And Professor Singh, finally, while we're talking about India's consultative approach over the Myanmar issue, it does reflect greatly on the manner in which United Nations as a grouping, we've spoken about it time and again, needs to reorient the way in which it looks at problems and solutions. A problem at a local region needs solution with the regional partners. It does not just apply to Myanmar, but many other regions as we speak.
True, I think we have to understand that international diplomacy in the last 70, 75 years has clearly moved towards submitry rather than sort of conference diplomacy, which is where General Assembly used to play an enormous role. And now the heads of state and national leaders, I think, can come together and take this mission, which is technically possible. It is the way of doing things now. So leaders, particularly the regional leaders in ASEAN, have to really come together. And I think the top priority on which everyone around the world would agree is to ensure that the violence has to come under control. UN envoy in Myanmar, even the Chinese foreign minister, Chinese envoy ambassador in Myanmar, who is in close touch with
Right.
General Halian, has repeatedly mentioned that the situation is developing like a civil war. And I think that violence must end. On
Right.
that, there is clear consensus both in the international community and in the neighborhood. And that has to be pressed upon the military in Myanmar.
Right. On that